AM 1440 WNPV. It's Comment Please WNPV on this Tuesday afternoon, and during this segment of the program, we feature an interview that we did in June, early June, with Steve Gorem, the author of The Man-Mad World of Climatism, and he has a particular view about climate change. The White House today put out a report, and this is part of a release from the White House. With our country already experiencing the effects of climate change, the president has taken action to cut carbon pollution by moving to cleaner sources of energy and improving the energy efficiency of our cars, trucks, and buildings. But further steps are urgently needed to ensure that we leave our children a planet that is not polluted or damaged. The White House today released a new report from the Council on Economic Advisors that examines the economic consequences of delaying action to stem climate change. The report finds that delaying policy actions by a decade increases total mitigation costs by approximately 40%, and failing to take any action would risk substantial economic damage. These findings emphasize the need for policy action immediately. Well, Steve Gorem's got a slightly different view of climate change. This is our interview with Steve back in June, on June the 5th, actually, of this year, here on Comment Please by WNPV. Before we get into the issue of climatism, and I want your definition on that, you're the executive director of Climate Science Coalition of America. What is that?
Well, it's just a small organization, mostly consisting of myself, and then I have 10 advisors around the country. And we're not for profit, and my position is a volunteer position. But what we do is go out and talk to groups about the real facts about climate change and about energy, and try and educate people at universities and companies and wherever, because unfortunately there's a lot of misinformation about this whole topic. Despite what you hear in the press and from governments, more and more evidence shows that the radical position that climate change is natural is what is in fact true, and man-made influences are very small.
Who said the debate was over on this topic? Was that Al Gore? Was it Barack Obama?
Yeah, it was former Vice President Gore, and it was many others, possibly our current president.
Yeah.
And that's when somebody says that to you, you need to hold on to your wallet, because that's not the way science works.
Now, are you a mouthpiece for the oil industry or the coal industry, or what kind of dog do you have in this fight?
Well, those folks like my message. I was 30 years in the electronics industry, working at Motorola and others, and I like to say I've never received a payment from any energy company or anyone with a vested interest in the debate. I earn my money just by speaking and writing books, and this topic needs a lot of work. We need to dissolve the myths and get on to what the real story is.
So how do you plunge into the science from your position at Motorola? How do you segue from one into the other?
I'm completely attacking another direction. I just got on this issue, and I've written 2 books now, and I've written a bunch of columns for the Washington Times, and that's just what I do full time now, is go around and talk to groups. So it's disconnected, except that I have a pretty good experience with companies in the past and how they work and how they think.
What is climatism?
Climatism, in short, is the belief that mankind is causing dangerous climate change, and it's become a belief system. It's become an ideology and a vehicle for worldwide change of all of our society. And it is a belief system because it's further and further disconnected from the empirical data, which shows that current weather and current temperatures and droughts and floods and all the rest are not abnormal. They're all within natural variability that we've seen in the past.
So is climate change, is global warming, is that a means to an end, do you think, for some of these folks?
Well, I like to think, we're in this situation for 2 reasons. First, the world jumped to a conclusion. Back in the late 1980s, a number of computer modeler scientists said that man was causing dangerous climate change and convinced the world. So that's the first factor, kind of a quick decision on that, even though climate's been very uncertain. But second, we have a huge amount of dollars pushing this whole thing right now. An example is the United States government spends $9 billion a year for research on climate change, and that is well over 90% on the effects of man-caused climate change. Mm-hmm. So if you want any of that money at your university or your scientific organization, the one thing you must not say is that climate change is natural. Those are the people that don't get funding. So there's a lot of dollars, and that's just one element. You know, we have whole industries that have grown on being green and energy sources and environmental editors, deans of sustainability. So it's become a huge industry. The world's spending over $250 billion a year right now to try and stop the planet from warming.
Steve, how old are you?
I'm an old guy now.
How old are you? Don't be ashamed.
I'm starting my new career here in my early 60s.
All right. So I'm 52.
Yeah.
Did you go to the public schools?
I did.
Right. I went to the public schools not far from the radio station here in southeastern Pennsylvania.
Uh-huh.
The textbooks I guess it must have been the 70s at that point, indicated that there would be no coal, there would be no oil, there would be no fossil fuels by the end of the century. I mean, that's what the science said when I was in grade school.
Yeah, that's great material for my books. I put all these sidebars in called failed projections, mm-hmm. and there's just a whole bunch of those.
And that was accepted science at the time. That's why when everybody says the debate is over, well, I think the debate is always going on, or ought to be.
Here's a great one from Dr. Paul Ehrlich, who wrote The Population Bomb. By the year 2000, the United Kingdom will be simply a small group of impoverished islands inhabited by some 70 million hungry people. If I were a gambler, I would take even money that England would not exist in the year 2000. He made that quote in 1971. So, yeah, there's just a whole bunch of those predictions, and they don't seem to come through. Mankind seems to solve its problems, and the climate seems to be bumping along no matter what we do.
And it seems like global warming sort of fits into a much broader ideology to me. These people that sort of are of a mind like that doctor, that the population explosion was going to overwhelm us, the natural resources were going to be depleted, and that we had to make some massive changes to the direction of our existence. And it seems to me that ideology is still reflected in the beliefs of these people.
Absolutely right. Those are two of the things that are the foundations, the resource depletion, overpopulation. The other two, I call them the four horsemen of the apocalypse. The other two are increasing world pollution mm-hmm. and destruction of the climate. Those four things underlie a lot of the environmental movement today. But and I've done whole presentations on that topic. If you look at the data and the empirical data, you find that the world continues to change for the better. Pollution's going down in all of the developed nations, et cetera, et cetera. And so the fears are way overstated, and mankind is solving the problems as we go along here.
And I said this at the beginning of the show, and I've been saying it for years, even before this whole political debate about global warming had gotten kicked up, that it seemed to me that the weather was changing, that something was happening to the weather in the globe, that things were getting there were more extremes. Is that true, or is it not true?
Yeah, I don't really think that is true, that there are more extremes. Certainly climate changes. We've actually the globe has gone through a little bit of a warm period from 1975 to about 2000 or 2005. Mm-hmm. And that's tied to natural factors. We've had very active sun during that period, lots of sunspots, and that affects global temperatures. We've had the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, which is a big temperature cycle in the Pacific Ocean that varies 1 or 2 degrees over 60 years or so. Mm-hmm. That's been in a warm phase. That turned cool about 2005. There's a big cycle in the Atlantic called the Atlantic Multi-Decadal Oscillation. These temperature cycles are occurring all the time, and so our weather changes. And so the frequency of storms and the size of them changes. But whether these are more extreme, we're really not seeing anything in the last 100 years that is more extreme than what we've seen in previous centuries.
Are the ice caps melting? Are the glaciers melting? They seem to be retreating in some areas, certainly.
Yeah, well, we have been actually, the world's been warming for about 400 years, since a period called the Little Ice Age, when the Thames River in England used to freeze solid every year at London. So we've been in a warming period. We have one ice cap that is shrinking right now, has been for the last 30 years. That's the Arctic ice.
Mm-hmm.
But the other ice cap, Antarctic ice, Antarctic sea ice has been getting bigger, and the thickness of Antarctic South Pole ice has been getting thicker. So the South Pole ice cap is getting bigger.
Really?
And the Arctic ice is shrinking. And probably on net, glaciers around the world are declining somewhat.
All I see are these pictures of the polar bears swimming where they can't find any ice to sit on anymore.
Well, polar bears love this warming climate, actually. From a correlation point of view, we've got about twice as many polar bears as we had in the 1960s.
Really?
Now, the reason is not because it's getting warmer. The reason is that there are now hunting restrictions that were put in the 1970s.
Wow.
But there is no evidence that the polar bears are endangered. We have something like 25,000 of them on the surface of the Earth nowadays. And the Inuit people will say this is the year of the most bear. And there's so many bears up there that they are breaking into cabins, and they really are becoming a nuisance in many ways, contrary to what you hear from the World Wildlife Fund and Coca-Cola.
Talk about your inconvenient truth. Holy cow, that is... we mentioned Al Gore before, and of course that was the title of his documentary that he did.
Yeah.
How many? I'm sure you've seen it again and again and again, and reviewed it and critiqued it. If that is accepted as the given science of the time, how riddled with mistakes is it?
Well, Mr. Gore goes to some liberties to be very alarmist about sea level rise. For example, he shows about a dozen pages in his book of what would happen if some of the ice caps melt, flooding of Florida and San Francisco and a lot of cities around the world.
Yeah.
But it's interesting that the High Court of England, England started showing his movie, An Inconvenient Truth, in all of their schools.
Really? Okay.
And suit was brought against that. And there was actually a court case for the High Court of England, and he came up with, I'm trying to find the reference here right now, but he came up with 9 errors on how the inconvenient truth was wrong, and he said that these had to be accompanied with a film. Number 1 was Mr. Gore's forecast of sea level rise of up to 20 feet is not in line with scientific consensus. His claim that low-lying Pacific islands are being inundated due to global warming is not supported by evidence, and on and on. There are 9 of those. So Mr. Gore is kind of alarmist in his books, and the actual empirical data does not show that a lot of his projections were correct.
Are sea levels going up at all?
Yes, right now they're pretty flat, but as NASA has said, sea levels have risen for about 20,000 feet. About 20,000 years.
Mm-hmm.
They've risen 20,000 years. They've risen about 390 feet over that period since the last ice age. Over the last century, they've risen about 7 inches on average across the world. So sea level rise is natural. No scientist can tell you when natural sea level rise stopped and man-made sea level rise started. And so we need to adapt to that like we adapt to all changes on our Earth.
Of course, Hurricane Sandy, which was, that devastating storm which impacted areas, including this area, which usually aren't impacted by hurricanes, certainly get everybody's attention. And the thought was that, we have now additionally vulnerable areas along the seacoast, and this is going to become the norm as opposed to the exception.
Yeah, the error there is that there's been a change. Sandy was a special storm. It was heading out into the North Atlantic when it bumped into a high-pressure area, got redirected, came in and made a direct hit on New York City. It hit at high tide, which made the flooding worse, and it also ran into a cold front coming from the west at the same time, making it a big turbulent storm. But this has happened before. The 1821 Norfolk and Long Island hurricane came right up the east coast of the Atlantic, slammed into New Jersey as a Category 3 or 4 hurricane, much stronger than Hurricane Sandy. It hit New York City at low tide, which was about 5 foot lower ocean levels, but it flooded a third of Manhattan Island up to Canal Street. And if you look back on the 20th century, we've had 170 hurricanes make landfall in the United States. 59 of those were Category 3 or stronger. all of those 59 had stronger wind speeds than Hurricane Sandy. So the question that needs to be asked, well, why is one hurricane that makes a direct hit on New York City evidence that a trace gas in our atmosphere and man's tiny contribution to it are now causing dangerous climate change? Matter of fact, we're in the midst of a hurricane drought right now. It's been more than 3,000 days, 8 years since we've had a Category 3 hurricane make landfall in the United States. That has never happened on the record since we've been keeping the record. Typically, we have a Category 3 make landfall in the U.S. every other year. So we've been very, very lucky, and there is no evidence that hurricanes are either more frequent or stronger.
There was a famous hurricane that hit New England, I think it was 1933. It was before they started naming them, and devastated parts of Rhode Island, and I guess it was almost
1938. I forget the title of that one.
38, yes.
That killed about 600 or 800 people. It went all the way up into Canada and killed some people up there. There was also Hurricane Hazel in 1954, I believe. Both those two hurricanes were Category 3 or stronger.
Yeah.
That hit New York State as well. So you don't have to go back very far to find storms that were stronger than Sandy that hit the state of New York.
So it's not a new thing. One of the things that, there are areas of this country now that are going through terrible drought, and that is the kind of thing that it seems to me can also be cyclical. I mean, you do have areas, I guess there are parts of Texas now that are really being devastated by drought, but that has happened before too. Yes, it has. And they're talking about it in California now. If you go back in the 50s, California precipitation is very much tied to that Pacific Decadal Oscillation that I talked about. The PDO was in a cool phase from about 1940 to 1975, and when it is in a cool phase, we tend to get more La Nina conditions rather than El Niños in the Pacific, and California is drier. And they had several years of drought back in the 1950s. And they also have a history of having decades of drought if you look back centuries past. And then from 75 to 2000, the PDO went into a warm phase, and when that happens, we have a higher probability of El Niños and a higher probability of rain in Southern California. And now that cycle has gone cool again about 2005 or 6. So the probabilistic forecast for California is that they're going to go through drier periods for several decades. So we're going to hear this drought thing over and over. But this is not due, again, to a trace gas in the atmosphere. This is a natural cycle that occurs. The biggest thing affecting California's climate is that little thing off the west coast, which covers a third of the Earth's surface, called the Pacific Ocean. Yeah, well. And certainly we have, in terms of water resources, we have in certain parts of the country shifting population bases and more demand on water in certain cases. So, there's a heightened concern about. I guess we ought to be concerned about drinking water, but that also seems to be a tipping point for panic.
Yeah, well, that's another thing. I mean, water doesn't disappear. It basically stays pretty constant and comes down through the atmosphere, et cetera. But we are using more of it as our society goes and our processes grow. So the cost of water probably will be going up over time. But that's more of a characteristic of our modern society than any change in the climate here.
Yeah. What, they always say follow the money. So where do we follow the money in this case? Who's making money off of the green movement? And I don't like to condemn the green movement because I like to think of myself as being green to a certain extent. I don't litter, and I try and do the right thing if I'm going to be outside and try and do the right thing to the environment. But this movement is generating money for whom?
Yeah, money is a factor, and I don't like to get into that a lot because I find that the climatists, if you will, are very sincere that we have that they think that we're causing dangerous climate change and we have problems. But we do have, people are people, and many people have been fooled by this misguided idea. And many in the world have built their careers on this. They built their careers that climate change was a problem, that we have to reduce our carbon footprint. But more and more, your listeners should probably know that Earth naturally puts 25 times as much carbon dioxide into the atmosphere every day as man's industries across the world. 25 times as much. And carbon dioxide is not even Earth's most abundant greenhouse gas. It's second to water vapor. Somewhere between 70 and 90% of Earth's greenhouse effect is caused by water vapor and clouds. So this whole theory has been based on some assumptions. Now those aren't coming to pass. But, we do have huge amounts of money pushing this forward. Wind, solar, biofuels, all these regulations that are in place. And many industries, many people making money on this topic.
Is there a father? Is there a leading figure in the global warming movement?
Well, in my book, I talk about 5 folks that are sort of the leading alarmists, if you will. Former Vice President Gore, Dr. James Hansen, who was a scientist at NASA and a computer modeler. He first went before Congress and testified in 1988 that he was 99% sure that man was causing dangerous climate change and that the Earth was warming. That was a big sort of a special incident in the whole history.
I guess he wanted to give himself 1% of wiggle room, just in case.
A guy by the name of Bill McKibben, I think he's from Vermont, who has been out trying to urge universities to de-invest in fossil fuel companies. A guy by the name of Nicholas Stern in the United Kingdom, who wrote the Stern Report, which was a very alarming report. And a guy by the name of Tim Flannery in Australia, who's written in several books on this and sold 1 million copies or so. I put those on my top 5 list of spokespeople for the movement. But I think time will tell that these gentlemen are incorrect and that man-made influences are small.
And was this in the late 80s where this came about?
Yeah. The history is 1988. The Hansen testimony. That very same year, the United Nations formed the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which did their first assessment in 1990, concluded man was the cause of climate change. And then just 3 years later at the Rio de Janeiro Earth Summit, 1992, 41 nations and the European community signed a treaty saying they would reduce emissions. And for the last 20-some years, they've been arguing about when and how much to reduce emissions. But now for 17 years, we've not had a rise in global temperatures. Since 1997, temperatures have been flat. All of the computer models have been wrong. The IPCC projections, they did a high, medium, and a low projection for temperatures. We're far below that low temperature projection. So the climate is not playing ball with the projections here. The Earth is not playing ball, and the projections are getting farther and farther away from what's actually occurring. This last winter we had the coldest winter in 100 years since 1911, 1912. Yet the president's still pushing his policies to try and stop global warming.
Steve, where do you live, Steve?
Near Chicago.
Near Chicago. I don't know what it was like out there, but around here we were shoveling a lot of that global warming for about 3 months during this past winter.
Here's the danger. I don't know how much more time we have, but the president has put these policies into play through his EPA to reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 30% by the year 2030, and that basically means that the coal-fired power plants are not going to be able to operate anymore. Many people don't know, but we dodged a bullet this last winter. In congressional testimony just 2 months ago, Nicholas Akins, who was CEO of American Electric Power, which produces electricity in your area of Pennsylvania, he testified that, quote, "This country did not just dodge a bullet, we dodged a cannonball. In January, we hit new all-time peak winter load in your area, and we were very, very close to having electrical blackouts right when it was below zero." And they also testified that in the next 2 years, they're going to be closing coal-fired power plants, and they required 89% of the output from those plants to keep from going into blackouts. And this is from previous EPA regulations primarily. The president is piling on with his new climate rules, and I'm afraid to turn this thing around is going to take widespread electrical blackouts in the middle of winter, which is not something that we want to see.
Where is the political momentum? And obviously we had, with this announcement earlier this week through the EPA of the president's goals of reducing carbon emissions. That obviously was a seminal point, if you will. This whole Keystone Pipeline debate continues to be going on, and there was some indication that maybe the president would make some decision. He's getting a lot of pressure even from some Democrats to do that. Is this movement losing momentum?
Yeah, it's kind of strange here. It's they seem to have redoubled their efforts this last year.
I guess maybe because of pushback.
Maybe because of pushback, but unfortunately the president has surrounded himself with advisors that are in lockstep with this theory, despite what the evidence shows. It's really amazing. Lisa Jackson was testified last fall, and one of the questions that one of the senators asked her was, he said something, well, the president has said that the temperatures and the storms are worse than predicted. Can you agree with that statement? And she had to dodge that. She couldn't agree with that. They've had other congressional hearings where they've asked scientists and said, well, the president says that the storms are getting more severe. Can you agree with that statement? And the scientists that are testifying for the position of dangerous climate change can't agree with those statements. The evidence does not show that.
Mm-hmm.
So, but nevertheless, the ideology marches on, and it's going to cause a crash, I'm afraid, in terms of our electrical system.
Is the debate now over these, and there may be pushback, again, even from his own party, whether it's Keystone or whether it's these emissions, these power plant rules. Is this a seminal point in the whole debate right now? Are there other milestones that are coming up that we ought to be looking for?
I think this is the most serious regulation that's going into place. I mean, we have a whole raft of things, everything from banning of light bulbs, incandescent light bulbs, to CAFE mileage standards, corporate average fuel economy standards, to renewable portfolio standards in states that require an increasing amount of renewables. But this idea, the United States still gets 40% of its electricity from coal. It's the lowest cost power. In Pennsylvania, I think you're at a retail price of about 13 cents per kilowatt hour, and you still get 40% of your electricity from coal.
Mm-hmm.
Your neighbors, New Jersey's at about 16 cents per kilowatt hour, and New York's almost at 18, and they don't use much coal. They use natural gas and some other. This is going to hammer people in their pocketbooks. And as I say, the worst thing that may come down are brownouts and blackouts. We hope we don't get to that.
Yeah, and when you talk about coal is not what it used to be in terms. I mean, there have been so many advances in burning
that's
coal.
Right.
Yeah, that it's a completely different animal than it used to be.
We need to reduce real pollution. I kayaked whitewater rivers, including Pennsylvania, for 30 years. I'm a big guy for clean water and clean air, but we have the cleanest air we've had in more than 50 years. The biggest risk to the average American citizen is his campfire or his fireplace. The air, even according to EPA numbers, our air is very, very clean and getting cleaner all the time. And I'm talking about real pollutants now: carbon monoxide, nitrous oxide, sulfur dioxide, carbon particulates, lead. But this idea that carbon did I say dioxide? I should have meant monoxide, carbon monoxide.
Mm-hmm.
This idea that carbon dioxide is a pollutant is not correct. Very foolish. Does not cause harm to anybody. Great, it's plant food, and we need to get our terms straight and work on the real environmental problems, not CO2.
Well, what do cows emit?
Well, they emit CO2 when they breathe, like we do, and they emit methane as well.
Methane, right. I was referring to methane, and they talk about cows as being, and I'm sure that there's a whole probably a vegetarian vegan movement that's also plugged into this whole global warming thing.
Well, there's some goofy things. In Argentina, they just developed a bag they put on the back of cows that captures methane.
Uh-huh.
In Australia, they passed in December 2011 the Carbon Farming Initiative Act, and they have these, they call them feral camels.
Mm-hmm.
They have 1 million feral camels that are running around Australia, wild camels that are munching up the foliage and emitting methane. So you can now shoot camels in the wild and earn carbon credits. I mean, there's just some goofy things going on here.
Shoot a camel and reduce your carbon.
Camels, deers,
footprint.
goats, right.
Oh, well. Steve, is there a place where people can follow you, or whether you're tweeting or
my site,
blogging or whatever?
Climatism.net. They can order copies of my books. I'll sign them. They're also available at Amazon and Barnes & Noble. And then just look for it in the press. I try and get articles out there once a month. I'm writing a third book, so it's a little tough to be putting a lot of articles out. But
well, I don't think the debate is over. And now maybe it should be more intense than ever.
Yeah, this is going to go on for a long, long time here. And by the way, Europe is pulling back. We're still pushing this in the United States, but renewables investment in Europe fell 50% last year. Globally, it's fallen 10% over the last 2 years. The subsidies are being reduced. The mandates are being reduced. Not so much in the United States yet. We still are yet to wake up.
And that was our conversation with Steve Gorem from early in June. And he, of course, the author of The Man-Mad World of Climatism. And you can find out more at climatism.net. Stay tuned. We're going to have more on Comment Please WNPV in a moment.